At a moment of growing tension over trade, tariffs, and a looming federal government shutdown, a Michigan congresswoman delivered a pointed critique of recent US economic and industrial policy. Her remarks touched on supply chains, rare earth minerals, public-private partnerships, and the stakes facing Americans if government funding lapses. Below is a reconstructed narrative of her arguments, with essential quotes and interwoven with up-to-date context and fact checks. She began by challenging the narrative that a blanket tariff policy alone could address structural weaknesses in the US economy. This is 100% additional tariff. Is this bluster or the end of our economic relationship? I introduced legislation that I call Unearth America's Future Act. It's legislation based off the CHIPS and Science Act to bring processing and refining of critical minerals and rare earth elements here to the United States of America. In fact, in July 2025, Representative Haley Stevens, DMI, introduced H.R. 4350, the Unearth America's Future Act, aimed at establishing federal loan programs, tax incentives, and support for domestic production of critical materials. She stressed the urgency. This is a major component of our supply chain, and yet we ceded all the ground to China, and we're very dependent on them. She contrasted her approach with what she described as erratic tariff moves. Donald Trump's approach isn't going to totally get us out of it. You know, the wild, chaotic, erratic tariffs that just react to everything. We had 55 tariff announcements in 100 days, which are also causing our prices to just rise on everyday goods, including groceries. To guard against that inflationary pressure, she noted, which is also why I wrote a bill called No Tariffs on Groceries Act. Her argument, targeted investment in critical mineral infrastructure rather than sweeping tariff spikes, offers a more stable path forward, especially when market prices are sensitive and supply chains are fragile. She urged cooperation across party lines, even though her own party is in the minority. I think it's a good opportunity, a good time, even though I'm in the minority party, for us to do and get back to real industrial policy. The conversation turned next to rare earth minerals, which have emerged as a focal point in strategic competition with China. The Congresswoman pointed to the deep US reliance on Chinese processing, saying 95%, is being sent over there. In some cases, the processing and it's taking place over the year. That's inexcusable. She warned of a geopolitical risk. We shouldn't be wholly reliant on China. She also suggested public-private partnerships might play a role. Some of those public-private partnerships could be interesting arrangements, and I certainly support loan guarantees and tax credits and the like, and a reawakening of American industry in places where we've ceded ground to China in the rare earths space. She referenced her own experience in government interventions. As someone who served as chief of staff from the US Auto Rescue, we did take a stake in companies during their downturn, and we didn't control the day-to-day management of them. She raised inconvenient truths about infrastructure pressures back home. We've got people who want to access those jobs and to have lower cost, and we shouldn't be wholly reliant on China. She further noted tensions over data and energy sectors. When I look at big tech and big air companies, there's questions around why, particularly for artificial intelligence, some of the big dogs in the room haven't gone public. And there's also public goods that get utilized. We're going to start seeing larger fights over data centers. Our hydropower capabilities are going to come into question. And yet we also have very old water pipes in my state. And who's going to pay for the fixing of 100-year-old pipes? I don't want to saddle my consumers with that. Her point, as the US edges into more ambitious infrastructure and energy transitions, balancing burden, control and investment will be politically fraught. Pivoting to the spectre of a federal shutdown, she warned that everyday Americans would feel the pain first. We are in a healthcare crisis, and the responsibility of this moment is with the governing party. She placed the burden on Republicans, who currently control the White House, the Senate and the House leadership, to negotiate in good faith. What they are not doing is working in a very reasonable way with the other side of the aisle to keep the government funded. She pressed the stakes with Michigan-specific numbers. 700,000 Michiganders who are going to lose their health care when these Medicaid cuts go on effect. She described notices already sent to residents warning them of coming changes, notices that were given in the summer from this tax bill to Michiganders about their health care coverage and their benefits. She also underscored the human cost of delay. People can't afford more. Pressing on, she turned to her Senate campaign messaging. I'm putting up my hand to run for United States Senate in this moment because, frankly, the dignity of work for Michiganders needs to be restored at the lawmaking table. She made a contrast with her opponent, Mike Rogers, who I'm running against. He wants to rubber stamp Donald Trump. I want to rubber stamp my state and get Michigan what they deserve. She then shifted to federal employment cuts, a flashpoint in many shutdown debates. The Office of Personnel Management reports Michigan has just over 27,000 civilian federal employees. She said, these illegal firings, why firing 200,000 people, not lowering our debt as a result of that, is a breaking point for this administration. Pressing the point further, that's the number you're hearing. Is it 200,000 people? She summarized the mood among government workers. I am hearing from federal employees and they want their pocketbook affected. They certainly take a lot of pride in their work. To better ground the acting remarks in the current setting, here's a fact check on the main players, legislation and threats. Donald Trump is currently President of the United States as of October 2025. The Unearth America's Future Act, H.R. 4350, is active in the 119th Congress. It aims to support domestic critical material manufacturing through loans, tax credits, and public-private partnerships. The claim of 55 tariff announcements in 100 days is consistent with volatility and policy churn in the current administration's trade posture, though exact counting may depend on how one defines tariff announcement. The US is heavily dependent on China for processing of rare earth minerals. Many supply chain analysts have flagged a strategic vulnerability there. Mike Rogers, her Senate opponent, is a Republican candidate for US Senate from Michigan and has expressed alignment with President Trump. The government shutdown scenario is active. Republicans have blocked continuations of funding and have rejected proposals, including extensions of ACA Affordable Care Act tax credits. Michigan Democrats have vigorously framed this as a Republican-led shutdown that imperils health care for their constituents. What emerges from her remarks is a deeper tension in US policymaking between reactive trade tools and strategic structural investment, between short-term brinkmanship and long-term stability, between national security as slogan and national security as supply chain. Her core pitch: the US cannot afford to rely passively on China for steady flows of rare earths, critical minerals, or component processing. Tariffs, especially unpredictable ones, only inflame costs and uncertainty. What's needed, she argues, is an industrial renewal anchored in strategic investment, public support, and long-game thinking. She concedes that even bold tariffs would not suffice without an underlying industry anchor. Donald Trump's approach isn't going to totally get us out of it. In her framing, she's offering a different route: incentives, oversight, partnerships, and safeguards to revive US capacity in areas long surrendered. Yet the political calculus is steep. She recasts the looming federal shutdown not as procedural squabbling, but as a crisis with real consequences in healthcare, livelihood, and dignity. She condemns ideological obstruction. We are in a healthcare crisis. People can't afford more. She makes the person-to-person case, benefit cut notices, Medicaid termination, escalating costs. Her pitch is that as a US senator, she would fight not for party, but for state. Whoever takes office, the next years will test whether the US can transform strategic rhetoric about supply chains into actual resilience, particularly in minerals, manufacturing, and energy transition domains. And as Congress grapples with shutdown politics, the collateral damage could prove sharp, not just for Michigan, but for many Americans.